All right, so where do we even begin with morality? I mean, it's this massive question philosophers have been wrestling with forever.
Yeah, for like literally millennia.
Millennia. And we still don't really have a completely satisfying answer. I was reading The Economist recently, and they pointed that out too. And then they proposed this really interesting idea, which is what if? What if biologists are actually the ones who crack the code on morality? I mean,
Yeah.
think about it, our listeners, they're smart people, they like to get to the heart of things quickly, but thoroughly. So let's do this deep dive, explore this idea that morality and evolution are somehow like intertwined.
It's a fascinating proposition, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you come at it from a more philosophical angle.
Yeah.
Because the evolutionary perspective on morality isn't just about like, oh, where did our moral sense come from?
Yeah.
But it also gets into these really big questions like, can evolution tell us how we should live? And what about the very nature of moral truth? Is that even affected by evolution?
It's huge. So to really map out this whole landscape, we're going to be focusing on this really comprehensive entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's called Morality and Evolutionary Biology.
Yeah, it's a great starting point.
It is, because it breaks the whole thing down into these really clear sections. So first, you've got descriptive evolutionary ethics, which is basically the attempt to explain morality, scientifically. And then there's prescriptive evolutionary ethics. Can evolution actually tell us what's right and wrong? And then, and this is where it gets really deep, there's evolutionary metaethics. What does all this mean for the very status of morality? I mean, is it all just genes in the end?
Right. Some big questions there.
Yeah, big questions. But the good news is we're going to pull out the most important stuff from the Stanford entry, give our listeners a solid understanding without, getting too bogged down in all the academic jargon.
Yeah, we want to keep it digestible.
Exactly. So first things first, descriptive evolutionary ethics. I mean, this is all about explaining morality as it exists, right? Not debating what should be moral. So for a philosopher, it's crucial to start by making a clear distinction, empirical versus normative. And here, we're firmly in the empirical realm.
Yeah, we're talking about morality as a set of phenomena, things we could observe and study, like, how we make moral judgments, why we feel guilt, our sense of fairness. These are all, psychological and behavioral things that science can investigate.
Right. So what are the mechanisms? Where did these tendencies come from? And the interesting thing is, our source points out that evolutionary explanations, they operate at different levels. So like we might talk about the evolution of our general capacity for moral judgment, or we might be looking at specific moral intuitions, like why we're averse to harming innocent people, for instance.
And that gets into a really interesting debate, right? Which is our capacity for moral judgment an adaptation? Did it evolve specifically because it was beneficial for survival and reproduction? Or is it more like a byproduct, something that just kind of came along for the ride with other, advantageous traits, like our big brains that are good at solving problems?
Okay, yeah, so that's a crucial distinction. If morality is an adaptation, then it means, having a sense of right and wrong actually gave our ancestors an edge. Like maybe it helped with cooperation within groups, making those groups more successful. But if it's just a byproduct, then it's like, well, we got these amazing thinking machines, and oh, by the way, they can also do morality.
Yeah, it's subtle, but it really changes how you view the fundamental nature of morality. Now, this leads us to altruism, which is a really central concept in evolutionary explanations of social behavior. And our source makes a really important distinction between biological altruism and psychological altruism.
All right, let's break that down.
So biological altruism, from an evolutionary perspective, is any behavior that helps another organism reproduce, regardless of the actor's intentions. The classic example is social insects, bees and ants.
Yeah, like worker bees. I mean, they're so dedicated to the colony.
They are.
They sacrifice their own reproduction, even their lives, for the hive, which seems totally bizarre from an individual, survival and reproduction perspective.
It does. But that's where kin selection theory comes in. It's a really powerful explanation for this seemingly selfless behavior. In a lot of social insect colonies, those worker bees are actually very closely related to the queen.
Okay, so they're basically helping their own genes by helping the queen.
Exactly. By helping the queen reproduce, they're indirectly promoting the survival of their own genes, even if they themselves don't get to reproduce. And this idea, it extends beyond just insects. It helps us understand certain altruistic behaviors in other animals, even humans to some extent. But, kin selection theory, it's not without its critics and controversies within evolutionary biology.
It's complex. So biological altruism is about genes, basically. But psychological altruism is different. It's more about, actually caring about others, wanting to benefit them for their own sake, like empathy, that kind of thing. It's altruism with intent.
Exactly. And the fascinating thing is that the same evolutionary mechanisms that explain biological altruism, the things like kin selection, reciprocal altruism, which is like the give and take of social interactions, and even group selection, where groups with more altruistic individuals might outcompete other groups, those mechanisms are also used to explain the evolution of psychological altruism.
So feeling good about helping others might have indirectly helped our genes get passed on. That's a neat connection. But what about when we help people who aren't related to us, like donating to a charity that helps, strangers on the other side of the world? This, what the source calls indiscriminate altruism. That seems harder to fit into this reproductive benefit framework.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it raises a really important question about the scope of evolutionary explanations. One hypothesis is that this kind of indiscriminate altruism is actually a byproduct. It's like a misfiring of those psychological mechanisms that originally evolved in the context of smaller social groups. Back then, helping others usually meant helping kin or someone you were likely to interact with again. But now, in our modern world, we have these same tendencies, but they're applied to, a much wider circle of people.
So it's like we're still wired for a different environment, kind of like how we have this craving for sugary and fatty foods. That was adaptive when those things were scarce, but now it leads to, well.
Yeah, exactly. Our evolved tendencies can be a little bit out of sync with our modern environment. Now, the source then gets into Kitcher's three-stage account of the evolution of morality, a really interesting model for how morality might have developed, building on these earlier forms of altruism.
Okay, let's hear it.
So, stage one. Imagine small groups engaged in what Kitcher calls coalition games. It's all about cooperation, but it's pretty basic. Like, you help someone who's helped you, very rudimentary reciprocity. There's not a lot of, emotional depth to it yet.
Okay, so a starting point, but maybe not that stable.
Right, easily disrupted by, more selfish impulses. But then, stage two, things get more interesting. This is where we see the evolution of what he calls emotionally laden normative guidance.
Now we're talking.
Yeah, this is where those social emotions, guilt, resentment, those come into play. And along with that, you have the development of social norms, rules, and the increasing importance of reputation. These things, they really help cement those initial altruistic tendencies and allowed for larger, more cooperative groups to form.
So it's not just the good feeling of helping, it's also like the bad feeling when you don't help.
Right, and the fear of social consequences. Think about norms regulating violence, sex, the emphasis on group loyalty. All these contributed to greater social cohesion.
Makes sense. And then stage three, this is where cultural evolution kicks in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All that stuff, the basic norms, the emotional responses, it creates a foundation for cultural evolution to work its magic. So over generations, you get the development of all these more sophisticated moral systems, beliefs, practices, institutions. The specific content of those moral codes, that's where things get really diverse and nuanced.
Okay, so we've traced a possible path from basic altruism to like full-blown morality. But then our source brings up this really important philosophical point. Autonomous moral reflection. The idea that our moral judgments aren't just determined by evolution, but also by, our ability to think for ourselves.
That's a big one for philosophers.
Yeah, and they talk about this autonomy assumption, which is basically the idea that humans, we can reason, we can follow internal standards of validity, whether it's math, science, or, most important for us, morality. It's saying we're not just robots programmed by our genes. We can deliberate, we can weigh reasons, and come to moral conclusions based on, principles, not just blind instinct.
It's crucial for being able to, actually make sense of ourselves as rational agents.
Right. Like if I say 2 + 2 = 4, I'm not saying that because it helps my ancestor survive on the savannah.
Right.
It's because of the logic of math, the proof. And the autonomy assumption is saying that at least some of our moral beliefs might be grounded in a similar way, in reasoned arguments, principles, not just, evolutionary baggage. But then there's this challenge to the autonomy idea. The mere rationalization hypothesis. This was made famous by Jonathan Haidt, who argued that a lot of our moral beliefs, they don't actually come from, deep thought and reasoning. They come from gut feelings, emotional responses. And we just invent reasons afterwards to justify those
It's
feelings.
kind of a humbling thought, isn't it?
It is. It's like our emotions are calling the shots, and then our rational mind is just trying to, spin it, come up with some story to make it sound good. The source gives the example of cleaning a toilet with a national flag. Like, a lot of people would say that's wrong, but they might struggle to explain why. And the hypothesis is that it's the emotional reaction, maybe disgust or something, that comes first, and then we try to rationalize it afterwards.
And there's probably some truth to that, right?
Yeah.
We're not always perfectly rational creatures.
Definitely not. But the source does point out that there are counter-arguments to this strong version of the rationalization hypothesis. Like maybe those gut feelings, those moral intuitions, they're actually informed by prior reflection, even if we're not conscious of it.
Yeah, it's not like our emotions and our reason are totally separate things.
Right, they're interconnected. And in that flag example, some people might genuinely believe it's disrespectful, a violation of, some deeper value. It's not just an arbitrary emotional response.
So the question of how much of our moral judgment is mere rationalization, that's still very much up for debate.
It's complicated. So taking all this into account, what's the main takeaway from descriptive evolutionary ethics? Can we really say evolution explains everything about our morality?
Probably not everything. The source talks about the modest evolutionary explanatory thesis, which I think is a good way to put it. Evolution, it definitely explains some of our basic capacities and tendencies that are relevant to morality.
Yeah.
And it might even partially explain some of the specific content of our moral beliefs. But it's very unlikely to be the whole story.
Okay, so evolution lays some groundwork, but it doesn't dictate the entire, moral code. Now let's move on to something that gets, well, a little more controversial. Evolutionary biology and normative ethics. Can evolution actually tell us how we ought to live?
Yeah, this is where philosophers tend to get a little wary, because they're all about the distinction between is and ought. Just because something is a certain way because of evolution or whatever, it doesn't automatically mean it ought to be that way.
Right, right. And the source brings up Herbert Spencer and social Darwinism, which is a classic example of trying to derive moral rules from evolution. Spencer, he saw evolution as this progressive force leading to, supposedly superior forms of social organization.
And he equated those superior forms with, moral goodness.
Right, which we know now that that's a misunderstanding of how evolution works.
It is. Evolution doesn't have a moral agenda built into it.
It's not aiming at some perfect society. And even Spencer, his idea of an evolved society, it actually emphasized cooperation and mutual aid.
It did.
Yeah.
But the point is, you can't just read moral values off of nature.
Yeah. And the source gives some pretty striking examples of traits that might have been adaptive, but are definitely not things we consider morally good. Like infanticide of stepchildren in some animal species or philandering behavior. Evolution doesn't care about those things.
Yeah, evolution's not making moral judgments. And this is what the source calls the autonomy of ethics. Normative ethics, as a philosophical discipline, it has its own standards of justification. And those standards are separate from evolutionary biology. Just because something was advantageous for our ancestors, that doesn't mean we're morally obligated to do it now.
So evolved does not automatically mean good. But then the source talks about Joshua Green's work on the trolley problem, which seems to suggest that our evolved emotions do play a role in our moral judgments.
The trolley problem, it's a classic thought experiment.
Yeah, it really gets at these different moral intuitions we have.
It does. So you have the classic trolley dilemma, where you can divert a runaway trolley to kill one person instead of 5. And most people say, yeah, that's okay.
You're saving more lives. But then you have the bridge dilemma, where you have to push someone off a bridge to stop the trolley and save those 5. And most people say, no, that's wrong.
And Green's argument is that this difference in our intuitions is because of the way our brains process these situations. In the bridge case, the harm feels much more personal, direct. It triggers a strong emotional response. Whereas in the trolley case, it's more impersonal, abstract. We're thinking about numbers.
Okay, so our emotions are more engaged when it's up close and personal.
Right. And Green argues that these deontological intuitions, the idea that some actions are just inherently wrong, regardless of the consequences, those might be rooted in these evolved emotional responses. They were probably adaptive in our, small group past.
But the implication is that maybe they're not always the best guide for moral decision making in our modern world. Like maybe pushing that person off the bridge, even though it feels wrong, would actually be the more rational choice if you're just focused on saving lives.
Yeah, that's his argument. But the source also presents some pretty strong counter-arguments to Green's interpretation. Like, there are variations of the bridge dilemma where you just flip a switch to drop the person onto the tracks. It's the same outcome as pushing, but it feels less personal.
Mhm.
And yet, most people still say it's wrong.
So maybe there's more to it than just the directness of the action.
Right. And also, just because we make a moral judgment quickly, based on intuition, that doesn't necessarily mean there's no reasoning involved. Maybe our past reasoning has shaped those intuitions. And we shouldn't forget about the possibility of, overdetermination. Maybe both our emotions and our reasoned principles are pointing us in the same direction. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
So evolution might be playing a role, but it's not like it's short-circuiting our moral reasoning entirely.
Right, it's more
Ah.
complicated than that. Now, the source also discusses what it calls the corrective uses of evolutionary biology in normative ethics. This is where evolutionary thinking can actually help us improve our moral reasoning rather than trying to, replace it.
Okay, I like that. Using evolution as a tool to like refine our ethics.
Exactly. So even if evolution can't tell us what is right and wrong, it can help us identify false factual assumptions that sometimes underlie certain ethical viewpoints. A classic example is the argument for human specialness based on, the idea that we were created separately from other animals. Evolutionary theory, by showing our biological continuity with the rest of the animal kingdom, kind of undercuts that argument.
Right. If we're all part of the same evolutionary tree, then this idea that humans are radically different, morally superior, it becomes harder to defend.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Although, people who believe in human dignity might say, well, it's not just about separate creation. It's about our unique capacities, our intelligence, our moral sense. But the point is, evolution can challenge those assumptions that are based purely on, religious or traditional views of human origins.
And it can also help us understand our biases, right? Like racism, homophobia, if those are shown to be rooted in some outdated evolutionary tendency, then that weakens their moral justification.
Exactly. And if we understand our psychological vulnerabilities, like the tendency to be cruel when we have power over others, that can help us design better social institutions, practices that mitigate those risks.
Okay, so evolution's like a fact checker in a way. It can help us spot bad arguments, hidden biases, but it doesn't give us the moral principles themselves. Now, what about moral progress? Can we actually become more moral over time? Does evolution have anything to say about that?
That's a big question. There's this somewhat pessimistic view called evoconservatism, which says that our evolved psychology, with its tribal tendencies, kind of puts a limit on how much moral progress is
Or
possible.
we're stuck with our primitive instincts.
Well, that's the pessimistic view. Then there's the eviliberal view, which is more optimistic. They say, okay, maybe we have these limitations, but we can use technology, bioengineering, to actually change our nature.
Enhance our morality. I mean, that sounds pretty sci-fi.
It does. But the source presents a more nuanced view, which is the biocultural perspective,
Mm.
particularly the work of Buchanan and Powell. Their model emphasizes the adaptive plasticity of our moral psychology. It's not that we're, hardwired to be tribal or universally altruistic.
It's more like we have the potential for both.
Exactly. And which one gets expressed depends a lot on the social environment. Like when we feel threatened, when there's competition for resources, that tends to bring out our more tribal side.
Makes sense. Like if you think another group is going to take what's yours, you're less likely to be, compassionate towards them.
Right. But when those threats are absent, we can be much more inclusive, cooperative.
So moral progress is possible, but it's fragile. It depends on creating the right social conditions.
That's the idea. And it's important to be aware of the things that can trigger those more negative tendencies, like, demagogic populism, disinformation, things that create a sense of threat.
So it's not just about like being nice people, it's also about building societies that foster the right kind of environment.
Exactly. Now, let's move on to the most abstract part of this whole discussion. Evolutionary metataphics. This is where things get really deep, philosophically speaking. It's about the implications of evolution for our understanding of, like, what morality is, whether it's even real.
Okay, I'm ready to go deep.
All right. So a key concept here is the evolutionary debunking argument. And this is basically the idea that if our capacity for moral judgment evolved for reasons other than tracking objective moral truth, then that gives us reason to doubt whether there even is such a thing as objective moral truth. Or at least, it makes it hard to see how we could ever know it. This gets into the big debate between moral realists and moral skeptics.
Okay, so the argument goes something like this. Natural selection shaped our moral sense to help us survive and reproduce, right?
Yeah.
Not to, like, see moral truth.
Right.
So if our moral beliefs happen to align with some objective moral reality, that's just a lucky coincidence. It's not because our moral sense is, like, designed to be accurate in that way.
Exactly. And this is what Sharon Street calls the Darwinian dilemma.
Yeah.
Either our moral judgments have nothing to do with objective moral truth, which leads to skepticism, or the realists have to explain why evolution would have led us to track moral truth, which seems pretty implausible.
Right, because evolution's all about, like, fitness, not truth-seeking.
Yeah. But the source does point out that philosophers have come up with some counter-arguments. Like, look, we're capable of grasping all sorts of truths, even really abstract ones, that had nothing to do with our ancestors' survival.
Yeah, like quantum physics or, really complex philosophy. Our ancestors didn't need to understand those things to, like, hunt and gather.
Right. So maybe our moral reasoning ability is kind of similar. Maybe it's a byproduct of our general intelligence that allows us to, reflect on things, use logic, and arrive at moral knowledge. And some realists also question this idea that evolution has completely distorted all of our moral beliefs. They say, no, we have this capacity for autonomous reflection. We can think for ourselves, and that allows us to break free from, those purely evolutionary influences.
Okay, so maybe evolution gives us the raw materials, but we can use reason to, like, shape those materials into something more objective, more truthful.
That's the argument. And then there's Richard Joyce, who focuses on the origins of our moral concepts. He says, look, if we can explain why we have the moral beliefs we do, just by looking at evolution and psychology, without ever needing to appeal to these objective moral facts, then maybe those facts are just unnecessary.
So it's like, if we can tell a complete story about morality without invoking these grand objective truths, then maybe those truths just aren't there.
Right, and he used the analogy of like religious beliefs. We can explain why people believe in God or whatever by looking at social and psychological factors. And it doesn't mean those beliefs are true.
It's just explaining where the beliefs come from, not whether they're actually pointing to something real.
Exactly. But then, of course, there are counter-arguments to Joyce as well. Like, maybe even if our initial moral concepts had evolutionary roots, cultural evolution, philosophical reflection, those have refined them, turned them into tools that can actually grasp moral truth.
So it's not just about where the concepts came from, but how they've been developed, how we use them. And the source even mentions Darwin himself, who had some skeptical thoughts about morality. He imagined these rational bees with a completely different social structure and needs, and he wondered if they would have a completely different moral sense.
Yeah, that's a classic thought experiment. And it does suggest that maybe morality is just relative to, our particular species, our environment, not something universal.
But then again, you could argue that even those bees, if they were rational enough, they might still arrive at some moral insights that overlap with ours. Like, maybe there are some basic moral principles that any rational being would recognize.
That's a possibility. And then there's this tactic that some philosophers use, selective evolutionary debunking arguments. They try to use evolution to undermine certain moral beliefs, but they say their own favorite theory is somehow immune to that same debunking.
So they're wielding evolution as a weapon, but they don't want it turned on them.
Right. Like, some people try to debunk non-utilitarian ethics by saying, look, those are just based on evolved emotions. But then they say, oh, but utilitarianism, that's totally fine. That's rational.
But then the question becomes, well, couldn't you use the same argument against utilitarianism? Like, maybe its emphasis on impartial concern for everyone. Maybe that's just a misfiring of our evolved tendency to be altruistic towards our kin group.
Exactly. So you got to be careful with those debunking arguments. You might end up undermining your own position. And finally, the source touches on the relationship between evolution and expressivism, which is the idea that moral judgments aren't really about stating facts. They're more about expressing emotions, attitudes, or accepting social norms.
Okay, so it's not this is good. It's more like I approve of this or boo, bad.
Yeah, something like that. And the argument is that the evolutionary story of morality, how it evolved for social coordination and all that, it fits nicely with expressivism.
Because those shared norms, those emotional expressions, they're really important for social cohesion. And evolution provides a nice explanation for why we have those things.
It does. But even here, the source points out that this doesn't automatically rule out other metaethical views, like moral realism. Even if the original purpose of moral judgments was just social coordination, that doesn't mean they can't also be about truth and falsity.
Right. Like if I say stealing is wrong, maybe I'm expressing disapproval, but maybe I also genuinely believe that there is like an objective moral fact about stealing being wrong.
Exactly. So even in metaethics, evolution doesn't provide all the answers.
Hmm.
It gives us some interesting things to think about, but it doesn't settle the debate.
Well, this has been a pretty mind-bending journey. We've covered so much ground, from the origins of morality to the really deep philosophical implications of evolution.
It really shows how interconnected these different fields are. Biology, psychology, philosophy, you need all of them to really understand morality.
Absolutely. So, our final thought for you, dear listener, is this. Knowing what we know about where morality might have come from, about its evolutionary roots, how should that inform our thinking about where morality should go in the future?
Yeah, it's a big question,
Yeah.
and it's one that we all have to grapple with.
Exactly. So keep thinking, keep exploring. There's a whole world of fascinating research out there at the intersection of philosophy and biology, and we encourage you to dive in.